Or should I say, welcome. It is the time of the year again where we get to dress in silly little costumes and have fun while doing trick or treat. But a few of you may know that you can increase your frequency of intake of sweets like Hershey's and Toblerone. And this
can lead to dental caries,
which eventually leads to cavity. So for today's topic, we're gonna discuss the eating frequency and clearance rates of a substrate. High-frequency exposure to fermentable carbohydrates such as sucrose may be the most important factor in producing cryogenic biofilm and ultimately caries lesion. Frequent ingestion of fermentable carbohydrates begins a series of changes in the local tooth environment, essentially changing the composition of the biofilm, thus favoring the growth of highly acidogenic bacteria that eventually leads to caries lesion formation. In contrast, when ingestion of fermentable carbohydrates are severely restricted or absent, biofilm growth typically does not lead to caries lesion. Dietary sucrose plays a leading role in the development of pathogenic biofilms and may be the most important factor in disruption of the normal healthy ecology of dental biofilm communities. Sucrose in particular allows the formation of extracellular polysaccharides which render the biofilm viscous and sticky. Because the eventual metabolic product of cryogenic diet is acid, in addition to caries lesions, the exposure of acidity from other sources, examples are dried fruits, fruit drinks, and other acidic foods and beverages, also may result to dental erosion. The dietary emphasis must include all intakes that results in acidity, not just sucrose.
So for the history of diet and dental caries, during ancient times, dental caries was only found in a low degree, because sugar and processed starch are completely absent from the diet. So, during ancient times, there is no sugar yet in their diet. Their diet only consisted of raw grains, fruits, and herbs. So, the presence of dental caries was barely evident during ancient times. In the Middle Stone Age and later Stone Age, significant number of caries teeth was found in the skull of hunter-gatherers. So, in this timeline, however, prevalence or presence of dental caries was high in the teeth of the hunter-gatherers. This is because of their diet, which consisted of pistachios, pine nuts, wild oats. So, nuts consist of fermented carbohydrates that causes cavities or dental caries. So, this is probably the reason why there are great number of caries in the teeth of hunter-gatherers. So, in late Middle Ages, diet of some changed when sugar from sugar cane was introduced in Europe. Though sugar was an exclusive and expensive product available only for the rich. So during this timeline, some people's diet changed. They consume foods and drinks that are sugary. And so their sugar consumption was obviously the dietary factor that leads to development of dental caries. So sugar cane was introduced in Europe, and sugar cane consists of 13% of sucrose, and we all know that sucrose is the most cryogenic. So historically, Queen Elizabeth I has a lot of black and rotten tooth, and also lost a lot of tooth. This is because of the Queen's sugary diet.
In the 18th century, the sugar consumption in the United Kingdom rose from 2 kg per capita or amount to 5.5 kg in 1780. There are very early references to sugar or sweet foods and dental caries by Forsyth in 1746, and shortly afterwards by Birdmore in 1769, who wrote that where sugar, tea, coffee, and sweetmeats are used in excess, the people even at an early age are remarkable for the badness of their teeth. Miller, who postulated the chemico-parasitic theory for caries, was the first to show experimentally the relationship between carbohydrates and caries. He demonstrated in vitro that incubation of carbohydrates containing foods with human saliva may result in the formation of lactic acid that could cause the mineralization. The acid formation was greater from cooked carbohydrates like potatoes and bread than from sugar. Consequently, he considered starch to be more detrimental to the teeth than sugar. Although he was well aware of the presence of the microbes on the tooth surface and in caries lesions, he did not identify the important role of dental plaque in caries, unlike Green-Waldman plaque.
In the 1930s, ecological studies were reported on the relationship between the prevalence of dental caries and diet. We are going to simply compare how diet and consumption of carbohydrates change from absence to presence of caries. The two tribes in Kenya, the Maasai and the Kikuyu, differ in their diet, where the Maasai has protein-rich diet, while Kikuyu has carbohydrate-rich diet. In the East Greenland Eskimos or Inuit, from diet dominated by meat and fat, changed to diet dominated by starches and sugars. At Tristan da Cunha, a remote island in the Atlantic Ocean, caries prevalence increased when Western dietary habits were introduced. In Basel, Switzerland, wartime restriction during World War II reduced sugar supply from about 40 to 16 kilograms per person per year, resulting in an increase in the percentage of caries-free children from about 2% to 15%. This improvement of oral health disappeared when sugar became freely available after the war ended. Similar data have been presented from Denmark, Finland, and Norway. From this data, it was concluded that the improvement was impressive at that time, but it was dwarfed with the start of fluoride supplies, oral hygiene instructions at school, and water fluoridation. This observation gave further ammunition to the discussion of the relative importance of sugar restriction versus the appropriate use of fluoride as a caries preventive measure.
In 1960, prior to the introduction of fluoride toothpaste, the effect between meal eating was given special attention. Children with little between meal eating exhibited decayed, missing, or failed primary teeth, while those eating more than 4 times between meals had an average 9.8 DMFT. In another study, children aged 6 to 13 years living in an Australian children's home, Hopewood House, consuming a mainly lacto-vegetarian diet with minimal amounts of sugar and refined flour, showed a low caries prevalence compared with a control group. However, caries levels rose to those found in the general population when the children left the home. And the relation between sugar consumption and the prevalence of dental caries has also been studied in subjects with hereditary fructose intolerance, who have to avoid eating fructose and sucrose. In 17 subjects with fructose intolerance, the daily sugar intake was 2.5 grams, while it was 48.2 grams for controls. The corresponding decayed, missing, or failed permanent teeth levels were 2.1 and 14.3. In spite of poor cleanliness and fluoride levels, caries were reduced to a very low level of dietary measures alone in the Hopewood research. Additionally, the prevalence of dental caries in young children's primary dentition is essentially non-existent and is only about 1/10 what it is in Australian children's permanent teeth. Additionally, the kids' diets changed once they were old enough to work for pay in the outside economy. After age 11, there is a sharp increase in the number of lost, decaying, and failed teeth, indicating that the teeth have not developed any long-term resistance to caries. Therefore, minimal consumption of sugar is okay and enough is enough, because too much can hurt you so much.
Experimental human studies. A apart from the historical data, knowledge on the relationship between data and dental caries is based on a limited number of experimental human studies. This is because it is not ethical to alter diet experimentally in a way that it is expected to cause caries. The Vipom study was a human experiment on adults living in a mental hospital in Sweden, where sugar consumption was increased and the relationship between variety of sugar intakes and caries increment was recorded. The main findings of the 5-year study were as follows. A low caries incidence was found when the diet was almost free of sugar. The caries progression rate increased with the addition of sugar to the diet, but to a varying degree depending on the manner of consumption. Sugar intake with meals such as sweet drinks or sweet bread resulted in a minor increase in the caries progression rate. The frequency of sugar intake influenced the caries progression rates. So the first one is a moderate caries increase was observed for the groups receiving chocolate 4 times daily, and a dramatic increase for the groups receiving 22 caramels, 24 toffees, or 8 toffees at and in between meals. So sugar consumed between meals in a highly retentive or sticky form resulted in the highest caries progression rate. Unfortunately, the consumption of sugar in a non-sticky form between meals was not studied. Thus, the latter conclusion does not exclude that sugar in a non-sticky form might be as cariogenic as a sticky form. So we have here the figure 8.1, where it is the information from the Vipom study, the average DMFT per person relative to the type and time of eating of various sugars and sugar-containing products. So solid lines, it represents the experimental periods with increased consumption between meals, while the dashed lines represent the control periods or the increased consumption only during the meals.
Although a classic, the Vipom study has some serious drawbacks, including a complex design where numerous modifications were made during the course of the study. It was carried out in an institution in a population that was not a representative of its era or of today's modern society. The participants had bad oral hygiene habits, and the use of fluoride was absent. Today, the ethics of the Vipom study would be unacceptable, but it is important to bear in mind that the link between sugar and caries was not definitely established at the time the study was carried out. In clinical studies, where different sugar substitutes have been evaluated, caries development in the control group can be used as indirect evidence for the impact of sugars on caries. The Turkish sugar study, a controlled longitudinal human study, involved 3 groups of adult subjects who during 25 months consumed a diet sweetened with either sucrose, fructose, or xylitol. An 85% reduction in caries increment was found for the individuals in the xylitol group and a 30% reduction for the fructose group compared with the sucrose group. Caries development was not observed in the xylitol group, suggesting effectiveness of removal of sucrose from the diet in caries control. When analyzing the non-cavitated and cavitated lesions separately, it was found that the subjects in the sucrose group developed more non-cavitated lesions than the subjects in the fructose group, while the subjects in the fructose group developed more cavitated lesions. There is no good biological explanation for these findings. Therefore, from the Turkish sugar studies, it cannot be concluded that substitution of sucrose by fructose is a worthwhile caries preventive measure.
In conclusion, a high-frequency exposure to fermentable carbohydrate, such as sucrose, may be the most important factor in producing cariogenic biofilm and ultimately carie lesion. So, the frequent injection of fermentable carbohydrate begins a series of changes in the local tooth environment, essentially changing the composition of the biofilm, thus the favoring of growth of high acidogenic bacteria that eventually leads to caries lesion formation. In contrast, when injection of fermentable carbohydrate is severely restricted or absent, biofilm growth typically does not lead to caries lesions. So sucrose plays a leading role in the development of pathogenic biofilm and may be the most important factor in disruption of the normal health ecology of dental biofilm community. Sucrose in particular allows the formation of extracellular polysaccharides, which renders the biofilm viscous and sticky. Because the eventual metabolic product of cryogenic diet is acid. In addition to caries lesion, the exposure to acidity from other sources, such as dried fruits, drinks, also may result in dental erosion.
Swatch it.